Yes, indeed. So, to begin this message, I kind of had a question for all of you to answer. Who had breakfast this morning? Very good. Very good. You can put your hands down now. I'll ask another set of questions here in a second. So, just to get an idea of kind of how hunger works for all of us. If you're like me, I can eat pretty much any time, so my mother's here to attest to that fact. She's seen it all her life. But indeed, I can eat probably about every 2-3 hours. That's when my appetite says, hey, it's time to eat again. So who's in that boat with me? Every 2-3 hours? Okay, we got a few people being truthful. How about every 4? 5? Okay, we're starting to see more hands. So, indeed, hunger is kind of a natural part about our human existence. We get hungry. There's delicious food to be had. It grows on trees. It comes up from the soil. And there's some tasty animals out there too. And so as we kind of look at today's stories, it's addressing a human need, but it has this twist on it. This twist of Christ not just saying, hey, God will provide, but giving it to his disciples, that you give them something to eat. And so as we ponder and think about these words, about how that calls us as Christians here today to live and to act in a world there is constant need from this basic necessity of food. Let us consider and find ways to be encouraged to give and care for others as Christ and God care for us. So let's dive into God's Word today and see what he has in store for us. Now, I always love going back to Genesis because that's kind of where everything begins. It's where we see the creation story. It's where we see the first human beings come about and the earliest beginnings of what it means to be human in this sin-sick world of ours. And so we learned about the story of Cain and Abel, and you probably were wondering, ooh, Pastor, it's a little dark here today. Indeed, it is a little bit. But here we find a very unique concept about what sin is, and ultimately of the question that ended today's reading about who is our brother's keeper. Now, sin is something that we often talk about, and we don't usually have to spend copious amounts of time on because, well, it's always in front of us. We see it in the news, we read about it in the newspapers, we deal with it internally as well. And so here we read about Cain's interaction with sin today, that he and his brother give this offering to God. One is favored, one is not. And so Cain begins to feel, I guess, this first case of jealousy and anger and resentment towards his brother because he got to be in the right and not him. But God, seeing this, comes down and has this conversation with Cain, asking him, why are you angry? Why are you downcast? Because if you did what was right, you'd be fine anyway. But I think the point is there at the tail end of what God says. That sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you. Now, when we think about sin kind of from that perspective, that sin's kind of out to get us, but sometimes there's easy sins to avoid, right? There's some sins that kind of have blaring lights that say you shouldn't do this. For example, I thought about this one. I thought about if you're just standing behind somebody, usually it's a pretty easy thing to say, I shouldn't reach into their pocket, take their wallet, take money out of it, put it into mine, and do that in a public setting. Of course we're like, yeah, that's probably not good, it's theft, it's in public, I'm in the wrong, maybe I shouldn't do it. But I think there's another side to sin. Yes, sin can be sinister and out to get you, and in very blaring ways do awful things before our eyes. But sin is also subtle. Sin can creep in, kind of like as God says here, it can crouch at the door just waiting for you to just open that door, just the tiniest bit for it to get in. Because what Cain experienced was, again, jealousy, resentment, and by itself, these things don't have to turn into sin. Cain could have just as easily put this aside, confessed, spoken to God, spoken to his brother, his mother and father, Adam and Eve about this. Jealousy doesn't always turn into murder. But it does if you let it fester, if you let it sit there and just focus on it. You don't add those elements of forgiveness and patience and just general perspective to say, hey, at least my brother had an offering that was good and pleasing. What can I learn from him? And so sin subtly found its way in, and left to its own devices, ended in the first murder in human history. And from this point, then, we see God asking this great question, one we often tend to not like to hear the answer of, because it calls all of us into this great conviction. Now, God wasn't asking the location of evil because God didn't know. Being all-knowing and all-powerful, God knew exactly what had transpired, but it put Cain on the spot to answer. He asked the question, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain replied, "I don't know," which was a lie. He knew exactly where Abel was. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, if we continued the reading, we'd see this response and the punishment that Cain gets as a result of his action. But the question has always been something unique as biblical scholars discuss it. Now, typically biblical scholars, because it's all interpretive work as we read God's holy word, don't always have beautiful, clean consensus, but they tend to agree on this point. The answer to this question, am I my brother's keeper? And by the way, for the ladies in the room, there's also the same question, am I my sister's keeper? It works in all instances. The answer is yes, we are. We're responsible for one another. Because as we see in Genesis, from the very beginning, we're all kind of intertwined and working together. It wasn't like Adam lived in his separate place in Eden. It was Adam's corner, and there was Eve's corner over here, which was a lot neater and nicer. Forgive my pun there. But instead, they were working together. They were made to be with one another, and these brothers were meant to be in this family relationship with each other. So, is Cain his brother's keeper? Yes. He can't get out of that relationship. That's always going to be his brother. And so he has the cause to care and to answer for and be in a relationship with his brother and all of those on earth. Now, jumping ahead some thousands of years to the ministry of Jesus Christ, here in Luke's gospel, we find an account of the Loaves and Fishes story. And this may be a little hard to make out depending upon where you're seated, but what you can see here is kind of a hillside that kind of crisscrosses back and forth with lines and lines of people. And were it not for the glare, you could probably see that some of the folks have baskets. They're distributing the food to these thousands and thousands of people. But here in Luke's account of the Loaves and Fishes miracle, yes, indeed, God bless you, the disciples have just come back from being sent out by Christ to go do the work he was preparing them to do, to go out and heal the sick, to minister, to preach the gospel. They come back and tell him about this, and then they head off to this place, just outside of Bethsaida. And here a large crowd gets word of it, and they come out to see Jesus as well. He teaches them, heals their sick, but it's getting late. And so the disciples have a concern. God bless you indeed. Their concern is, well, we don't have enough to feed these people. It's getting dark, and having this many people out, camping out in the countryside, well, it's not written, but that would look kind of like an encroaching army on some place. Because 5,000 people just kind of hanging out in the countryside doesn't always look so good. And plus, they note it's a lonely place. This wasn't exactly the best place for 5,000 people just to kind of camp out for the night. But instead of sending them away, Jesus says something unique here in Luke's gospel. He says, "You give them something to eat." Their reply, of course, is, well, all we have is this. And they bring forth the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Kind of basic provisions in this day and age. Bread was a huge part of their diet. They would eat pounds of it by the day. And fish you could pickle and have on your person. That way you don't have rotting fish in a desert climate. And so they would have these things. And they bring it forth, and their question is, here's what we got. Now, do you want us to go buy enough for the rest of these folks? Now, this is basically the same thing as what they said. They knew they didn't have enough, and their question to Jesus isn't, okay, would you like us to go and shop for 5,000 more people? It's an absurd question. It answers itself. It's a defeated question. Clearly, Jesus wasn't walking around with a treasury of money to feed 5,000 people, because that's on the scale of like a king or a governor. to supply that much. And there's nothing in the biblical account to say that Jesus was walking around with that type of money. So this is just a question to kind of say, come on, Jesus, we can't do this. Just send the folks away. Let them go and find food for themselves. And again, it's called the miracle of the 5,000 because there's 5,000 men there. Now, that doesn't account for the women or the children who would automatically be traveling with the head of the households, their husbands, their uncles, whomever they were staying with. And so it's a lot of folks. But instead, Jesus gives the instruction to sit the people down, gather them in groups, and then begins performing this miracle. Loaves and fishes, dividing this food and multiplying it so that all have enough. Now, generally, there's two ways this has been interpreted by scholars. That on the one hand, this is a miracle. This is Jesus literally miraculously dividing and multiplying 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed over 5,000 people. And again, not because he gave them a tiny little morsel that they ate and said, that's enough, Jesus, thank you very much. But this literally was a full meal that people left fulfilled. The other interpretation is that, hey, Jesus dividing this food inspired others to kind of give what they had on their person as well. I'm a little bit old school. I tend to go with the miraculous look on this thing because I see it as a good modeling for what God has done in our own lives. That God provides. And I'm sure all of us can bear witness to that fact in our own unique settings, in our families, or in our communities. We've seen God provide with a little and make it a lot. Because again, I really don't see Jesus, kind of doing what would be common for us. The idea of, okay, we have a lot of people coming over, let me go to Giant, stock up, get some good things to provide for people. Because, pardon my, wallet illustration, but, Christ isn't exactly going around with his Christ card, accepted everywhere, to get everything he needs. Only thing to remember today, I know. But God provides and multiplies this meal and gives it to people. Now, I've seen this in my own life because as I was in seminary, I was working a couple part-time jobs to make ends meet. I had my main job, which provided, money to live off of, health insurance, all that fun stuff. I had my almost full-time studies in seminary. And I was also interning at a church as part of that education. As you can imagine, I wasn't on easy street. It was going to get tight. The budget was pretty slim. But I felt convicted as someone that was preparing to enter ministry to say, hey, I still need to tithe and do my part to my church. And so I looked at the budget and said, ooh, I really could use that 10%. But said, all right, I'm still going to give it. And as I gave it, there always seemed to not just be enough people, but more than enough to get by each week, each month, and throughout those years that I completed my studies. God provided, because it wasn't there in the budget. It wasn't like I figured it out and said, all right, I can scrimp here and work that and coupon that and it works. No, there was always enough. That God was always providing. Things showed up. Monies became available. People would invite me over and make provisions. I mean, it really happened. And so I know for myself that the things we read here in Luke's gospel can happen here in this life. It's not something that just happens because Jesus was around. It happens daily. It's those beautiful miracles that go unnoticed. And so God provides. But there's one other key factor in this story today, and we'll see it up here in just a second. That Jesus wants you. So I took a little thing off of Uncle Sam there, kind of transitioned it over to Jesus Christ. And there you go. Part of Luke's account, differing from the other gospel writers, isn't that a little child is brought forward and to show that, we can all provide. It's that Christ tells us here that, hey, I want you to provide for these people. That baffled the disciples back then because they didn't have enough to feed 5,000. There was no way they could do it. The point was that with God they could. That it didn't make sense logically. They couldn't figure out a way to divide up those loaves and fishes to make it last, but they trusted in God, and miracles could indeed happen through them. And so it is for us today that we are called to still be the people that go out there and provide. Not just loaves and fishes, because not everybody eats fish, but to go out there and provide those necessities in life. whether it be food, whether it be a cool drink of water, whether it be a listening and caring presence in the room that gives people what they need because they haven't been listened to. They need someone to help share the burdens and loads of life. There's a lot of things we can provide that can be multiplied. It can be our time, it can be our talents, it can be simple things like food. But folks, we are called to go out there and be the hands and feet of Christ today. It's a hard truth. It's a hard truth like being our brother's keeper. It means we have to do some hard work. It might mean we have to go a little bit without. But we trust that God provides. That as we fulfill the command to care for others and to go out there, we can do it boldly because we know God has provided and has made that promise to continue to give us what we need, even as we give other folks what they need. So I encourage and challenge us all. Let's go out there. Let's care for people. Give of ourselves. Give to others that they may have what they need. And to see in us where it all comes from someone who provided for us, who loves us, cares for us, and indeed calls us to care for others. So go out there, folks. See some Loaves and Fishes miracle performed by you, that you can care for this world and change it indeed. Thanks be to God. Amen.